Good morning. It's with great pleasure that I introduce the winner of the 2022 CIHR CAEP Mid-Career Lecture Award in Emergency Medicine. Dr. Clare Atzema is a staff emergency physician in Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre. She's a senior scientist in Sunnybrook Research Institute and ICES. She's an associate professor in the University of Toronto and a decision editor for the Annals of Emergency Medicine. Dr. Atzema has over 120 peer-reviewed publications. Her main research focus is in cardiovascular emergencies, in atrial fibrillation, hypertension, and heart failure. She has been a member of the Canadian Cardiovascular Society Guideline Committee since 2014 and the CAEP Atrial Fibrillation Checklist Committee since 2017. With great pleasure, I invite Dr. Clare Atzema to the stage.
Good morning. Thank you all for getting up early on a Sunday morning. I know that's a big ask of shift workers, which most of you are. And I'm hoping you didn't come to hear about all things AFib, because that's actually not what I'm going to talk about in the next 45 minutes. It would be the obvious choice, I realize, and actually I would be much more comfortable just talking about my work. But after much consideration and consultation with other women in the field of varying stages of career, I decided that this platform that this award has given me was so great that I needed to talk about something bigger than my own research. And not to mention, if you want to know about all things AFib, like over the last 10 years, if I talked about that now, the vast majority of it would be completely out of date, because AFib management is such a moving target, I can barely keep up. There are many days when I wish I'd gone into anaphylaxis, like just epi. That doesn't work, try more epi. That doesn't work, try a different route of epi, right? And I picked AFib. So instead of showing you tables and figures, I'm just going to tell you a story. I have no disclosures. These are the only people who have ever funded me. And hashtag grateful. That's AFib. So my objectives are to highlight, sorry, I need my glasses to see that far, the barriers that I encountered en route to receiving this amazing award in Canadian EM research, as encountered, of course, by a cisgender woman. Some of these may apply to minorities as well, but obviously I can't directly comment, not being a minority myself. I'm going to review the rewards and the responsibilities as I see them that once you get to that place of success. And I'm going to briefly describe the benefits of infiltrating another specialty like cardiology. So when I think of barriers in my career, my mind goes immediately to medical school interviews. And many of you went through those, and you can probably remember your first interview, who sat across from you, the decor, colors of the office, and how you felt. And I know I was ridiculously nervous. I remember pressing my hands into my skirt so that he couldn't see that my hands were shaking so badly. I'd wanted to be a doctor since I was 14. I'd worked really hard, and it was frightening, and there was a lot on the line. And I don't remember a lot of the specifics, but I do remember one question he asked me, which was to name a current event. And after the initial panic of what do I say, I came up with what I thought was pretty good, and I said, next Monday is International Women's Day. And I thought, score. And his response was, and I remember it very specifically, that's a very North American construct, isn't it? Swing and a miss. And I gotta say, thank God we have changed so much since then. It's just a different world than it was back then. I heard Marcel use the word diversity when he was speaking in French. That just wasn't a word we used back then. It wasn't part of public lexicon. And I, as a woman, certainly didn't feel like I had any kind of advantage as a female, or my Bachelor of Arts degree probably didn't help. And I didn't get in. And I went back and I asked, basically, why didn't I get in? And God bless this man for being a straight shooter. I like straight shooters. Emerge people are all straight shooters. They just tell you like it is and you know what you're dealing with. And he literally said, it's because you have no doctors in your family. And that was true. And he went on to explain his rationale, which was that the government was investing in our education, and heavily. It was about $4,000 a year back then, and like a year or two later it became $25K a year. I think McMaster was the first place. And so the government was funding us, and what if we were to leave after 2 or 3 years? We decided this is not for us, and then they've lost all that investment. So that's why they had to know that we were going to be sticking around and that we knew what we were getting into, which I accepted as logical. I do recall thinking something's not quite right. Like, doesn't that just perpetuate more of the same? Like, basically an all-boys club for doctors' kids? And so really, in order to think about my barriers, they didn't just start at med school interviews. They started well back into my personal history, and for that we need to go back to the 1980s, when people wore acid-wash jeans like this and talked on a phone with a cord, preferably a really long cord like this one, and if you were really lucky, it had buttons on it. Because if you had the rotor, like I did, and you were calling into your local radio station when you were 11 years old trying to win Madonna tickets, like you were doomed. You were never gonna beat those people with the buttons. And that was before the redial button, and probably some of you have not even heard of that, but I'll get to the 1990s and the 2000s very soon. My mom drank Tab and I drank Tang, and we did the 20-minute workout together. This was the cheaper version of Jane Fonda because you didn't have to buy the videos, and we couldn't really afford the videos. Sunscreen wasn't a thing, and in fact, you tried to intensify the sun's rays using something that looks like what you put in your car when it's on a really hot day. And you know, parents back then just said, go out and play, and there was no sunscreen involved, and if you were like me, you kind of went out to the local forested area, built yourself a fort, which some little neighborhood shit invariably like destroyed. And then when you got older, you stole cigarettes from the parents and smoked them. And this was basically Dartmouth in the 1980s, of course. Not Dartmouth, the college. Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Prior to that, we were in St. John's, and prior to that, we were in Moncton. And this would be a perfect shed behind which we would smoke the parents' cigarettes that we'd stolen. And you're thinking, how did I get real estate from the 1980s off the web? This is from like 3 weeks ago. I just Googled real estate in this area, and this is exactly what's there. And the middle picture, that was kind of the affluent, well, we thought of the more affluent kid on the street. He had the phone with the buttons. Like, that was a really nice house. Needless to say, it was easy to get cigarettes. There were no parents who were doctors or any professionals that I can remember, like lawyers, accountants, nobody. Down in the corner there, that used to be what looked like a Tim Hortons back when they were Canadian, and my parents would take us there kind of 8:30, 8:40 at night because they were shutting at 9, and if they bought one thing, then they were throwing away their donuts back then, and so they would give it to us for free, and that's how we could get donuts, which was obviously awesome. So my dad worked for A&A Records and Tapes. This is Toronto, but obviously it was in Dartmouth. And he had great parties. I got to meet such luminaries as Nana Muscuri and Krista Berg, if any of you know any of them, when I was very little. And I can remember one party where it was so loud that I came downstairs and found my mother and a bunch of the neighbors underneath the kitchen table giggling, which now that I think about it, I can only surmise, but I think they were doing something that is now legal. And when I couldn't get her out to turn the music down, I went out into the living room and had to go through those saloon doors. We had the white saloon doors on the kitchen, and went out into the living room with these massive bodies, and I think it was Rod Stewart was pounding, looking for my father, and I could easily find him because he was dancing on top of the coffee table. Anyway, my mother came out and eventually just put me back to bed. So she worked for Stats Can occasionally. She was British, she had a very nice accent, so she really got good numbers. People would like to talk to the lady with the nice British accent. So that was sort of part-time to supplement. And she was from the UK, obviously, and she had 4 siblings, but none of them were doctors. And in fact, none of them could even afford to cross the pond, so we didn't really see them. And my father was an only child, also no doctors in the family or professionals. This is them in 2015. They're, just to give you context, they're still pretty fun, but they never became doctors. And then in my early teens, we moved to BC. My father got a job at Video One Wholesalers, and note the theme of doomed industries. We didn't know anyone there. We had no contacts at all, but it was a job opportunity, and I remember thinking, well, I was very angry because I went from being popular to the new girl, that, you know, our house was pretty affluent by comparison, it was pretty posh. And this was Port Coquitlam, which is better known as Poco, and unfortunately is best known now for one of the most notorious serial killings in Canadian history, and this is the Picton Pig Farm. And I used to ride my bike down that road all the time, I loved Anne of Green Gables and how she looked at things and found beauty in them. She renamed Barry's Pond into the Lake of Shining Waters, and the Pitt River was at the end of there, and I renamed that and a lot of other things, although I didn't. I remember looking in there and just thinking what a mess it was. It was car parts. But needless to say, there was no doctors that I knew of other than my family doctor, and certainly not living in that area. And then my father lost his job. He was laid off. It was a reorg, and that was really hard for us. I can remember going to the grocery store. I didn't want to go to the grocery store, my mother asked, because we would get up to the cashier and she'd pull out her checkbook, because you had to have a checkbook back then in your check. And we'd get to the end and she would have to start pulling things off because we couldn't afford it. And she would hand it to me and my brother to run them back, and there'd be a queue behind us. And aside from the chagrin of being a teenager and being seen like this, I was just scared that, we couldn't afford even groceries. And I remember hearing the fights of my parents over, my father wanted her to buy the no-name, the yellow brand, and she would buy the house stuff like Sobeys, like not even that great, and like 50 cents difference, but they would have these huge fights over it. And at that age, I think I was 13 going on 14, I decided I have to become a professional. I never want to live like this and have fights with my future spouse like this and have to worry about money, and I never want my kids to have to worry about this. And I was like 13, kind of amazing. I was thinking about my kids. And so that was my resolve. And honestly, after the pandemic, I kind of want to go back and hug that 13 going on 14-year-old and just say, hey, you did it. Like many of us still had jobs at least, and there were so many people who just didn't have a job and that security. So well done her. And then when I was 14, I opened my science textbook and saw, I think it was like so close to this, an electron microscope of a hemoglobin cell. And I just thought, that is amazing that little thing knows how to drop off oxygen at the right place, on its travels, and then pick it up again in the lung, and your heart just keeps beating. All of our hearts are still beating right now, and none of us are thinking about it. And how amazing is that? And I knew that's what I wanted to do. And I was in a country where a girl who was 14 could decide that. So that brings us to the mid-1990s, high school, undergrad. It was grunge, and I loved the new music by Kurt Cobain. I wanted to insert it here today, like Come As You Are, but I was worried that it would just derail the whole talk, because half the time it doesn't work. I listened to Pearl Jam, tried to avoid the mosh pit when I went dancing at clubs, so I didn't break anything, and wore Doc Martens all the time. And of course, I eschewed eyebrows, much like Kate Moss. And I studied a lot. My parents found out from the neighbors that I was going into medicine. I had an older brother and younger sister who were taking up a lot of time, so they found out from the neighbors, and they said, it's great, we support you, but we don't have any money, so you're going to have to do it all on scholarship or pay for it with jobs. So I'm not the type of person that can just read something once and have it memorized. I need to read and study, and that's what I did. This is, if you used Word back in the 1990s, this is a paperclip that popped up and would say, it looks like you're writing a letter. And I saw him a lot. And I did really well. I got A's across the board and pretty much all scholarship through undergrad. And I worked jobs, sometimes 2 jobs. IGA is a supermarket, and I worked at Sears at the same time. And part of my job as a cashier at IGA, I would stock the magazines. And one day I put out this magazine. I found the actual cover. Elle, at that time, was similar to Vogue, very high-end. And that woman in the top, that's Amber. And I had met her in Japan when I was modeling there. On my very first job, I was modeling women's funeral wear. It was mostly black, and they were having trouble with the lighting because I was so pale. I don't know if I could come out this pale now, but anyway. And she helped me figure out what I was supposed to do when the Japanese photographer would yell, "Hey," and I would have to do like a new pose. And I'll get to that in a minute. But I also worked at Kmart in the complaints desk, which I found very handy, good training for emergency medicine in the last 2 years. And specifically now, I worked at a restaurant and a pizza place and even consumers distributing, which I feel was way ahead of its time. They just couldn't stock things, much like Target. You gotta have the stock for the customers. And I rummaged under my stairs for you so you could see my comp card. This is what the agent would send out to people who are looking for a model for either print or commercial. And it was a great opportunity. I went to Japan because I am and was fiscally conservative, and I wouldn't go somewhere without a guarantee. And Japan offered you a guarantee for a couple of months' work. You'd have X amount of dollars, whereas everywhere else you just had to go and hope for the best. So that's why I went to Japan. It was a pretty great opportunity, and It was also hard work, and I know everyone's like, oh, modeling, how hard is that? Yeah, sure, if you get the job. Anyone who says that, you just say right back to them, you've never been a model or an actor. Like, I have great respect for people who pound the pavement and don't know where their next paycheck is coming from, because you go to 6 or 7 go-sees a day, and maybe one was interested, maybe, and if that was your full-time job, you don't know when you're going to get the next job, and that's tough to live with. So that was an experience. I'll give you a couple of the sort of poses that the Japanese liked back then. I was 19, and some of them I looked so much older. And that was that. It was about 2 months. So that's who I was when I presented for medical school interviews. I'd known since I was 14, this is what I want to do. I'd worked really hard, but I didn't have any doctors in my family. They also said, you don't know about the issues that are facing medicine today, and you don't have enough volunteer hours. And so I researched it, and I found this magazine called CMAJ, or CMAJ, that had all of the current issues. And of course, back then, there was no internet, so I had to fill out a form and send it in via mail to get a couple of these so I could learn about the issues. And I was aghast. It was $8 per issue. And I was only making $6.52 an hour at IGA, and I had to pay this. And can you imagine if my kids now said, I want to be a doctor, you could just have handed them a stack of CMAJs. Of course, now it's even free or online. But I didn't have that advantage. And the whole volunteer hours, why didn't it occur to me then, what an advantage that was for rich kids and a disadvantage for kids who have lower socioeconomic background? Because I didn't have time to be doing volunteer hours. I was working 2 jobs. I was studying like heck. And so I did it, but it's sort of amazing. Imagine if you had to also contribute to your family's income, how hard it would be to now throw in volunteer hours and how biased it was that we asked that. So I did some volunteer hours in a pre-op hold where I talked to people before they went into surgery and learned absolutely nothing. And I also worked in a local walk-in clinic. I just volunteered. It seemed to be very prosperous. It was run by 2 brothers, and they both drove sports cars, red and black, I remember. And they were older. They seemed old to me, but I think they were in their early 30s. And yeah, I was 22, 21. And I loved it. This was real medicine on the ground. And unfortunately, one of the brothers noticed or whatever, and he took a shine to me, and then he asked me out. And this was before, the position of power and authority was discussed as part of public discourse. And so I just had to handle it myself. I didn't want to piss him off or, not get my letter of reference. And this is what I had to do to get into med school. So I, talked to one of the medical office assistants and tried to push her to getting my letter faster and faster. And I went out with him once. I was horribly uncomfortable. I couldn't get out of the sports car very well. It was so low to the ground. But then I got the letter. And that's what I had to do back then. And I got in. Not right away. I got on the wait list. But I got the letter, the slightly thicker letter that many of you got. And I was just thrilled. Didn't matter what happened to me after that. I didn't care where I was going to go after that. I got in. But then in my second year, I did a couple rotations, or a couple shifts rather, in Emerge and Emergency if you're in the US. And I loved it. I loved how there was this cacophony around me, but in my head, I felt so calm. And I loved how people will tell you everything, the kind of stuff that it takes years to procure in a relationship to find out. They just walk in and tell you. And what a privilege that is to get past all the BS and the small talk, and people will tell you that. And I still love that about it. I also got married to someone who was supposed to be in my year but was in the year below. So I had to go through the CARMS match with him. I would have to take a year off. So that's what I did. I sent out emails to every EM researcher kind of in the same time zone. And I would do it every 2 weeks. A very happy, hey, if you want an MD for cheap who can run your studies, I'm here. And I kept doing it every 2 weeks. And after 3 times, so 6 weeks, someone responded. And I got to go to UCLA. I did live below poverty line, but because I was a student, I got to do dance classes in this very studio and drawing classes. And this was the Nexus group that had responded. It was Bill Maurer, who's on the end there. And he said he was waiting to see if I continued, was I really going to follow through? And Guy was his research manager. Unfortunately, he died a few years later. And beside him was this guy who showed up a couple days after I arrived, named Jerry Hoffman. And he spent time asking what I wanted to do. And it was just an amazing year. The two of them really invested in me, and I learned about, research and the politics of research, and just so much. And Jerry even took me on some of the local conferences, and I got to meet Rick Bucata and watch them record EM Rap. And talk about standing on the shoulders of giants. Like, I just felt like I could do anything, and the world was my oyster with the support of these two people, Bill and Jerry. And so I applied to all the EM residencies in Canada and got interviews everywhere, and lots across everywhere I applied to in America as well. And by that time, I had amassed more than 20 publications, most of them first authored. I had 10 referee letters, not because I meant to do 10, but I asked someone else a couple years ahead of me, and they said they had 10, so I was like, okay, that seems like the right number. Seemed like a lot, but, and unbeknownst to me, Jerry called ahead to all the residency directors to say, I guess, how great I was and how much potential. I don't know what he said. I only found out afterward. And he also sat me down and said, here's the kind of questions you need to ask if you're going to go on interviews. And to cut a long story short, I went unmatched in Canada. And it was incredibly demoralizing, and it was devastating. And I questioned my choices and my ability to make judgments and my future and what I was going to do. And I reflected a lot. And of course, in the American match, I had matched to my first choice. So I ranked very well by comparison, which made me sort of wonder, like, what's going on? And I reflected on the interviews. And in the American interviews, there was like a palpable excitement. It was big groups. There was lots of women that looked just like me. We were kind of a dime a dozen, the researcher types. Whereas in Canada, it was much smaller groups, and it was much more hesitant, thinking back. And they asked me some questions that I found very difficult to answer, and I'm just going to highlight two of them here. One of them was, are you teachable? And think if you're sitting there, how you would answer that. I remember thinking, like, hell yeah, like, I don't know anything about clinical emergency medicine. I'm just like a sponge, and I want to know it all. And I think I fumbled something like that because I didn't really know what the correct answer was, or was the outcome already decided for me. So I think part of it was that I had this high-profile person who called ahead on my behalf, and I had all these letters, and I was asking questions that sounded like I knew what I was talking about, what's your residency about? And that was my first insight of how I was coming off in Canada. Like, there was too much success, and I was going to be too big for my britches and hard to teach, and impossible to teach. And on the other end of the scale, I got asked, how do we know you won't be like Susan? Of course, I've changed her name. And Susan was 2 years, she was like an R3, and I'd only met her twice. She was really nice, and she apparently, I found out, had left emergency medicine entirely, not too successful, didn't succeed on the other extreme, and gone to an IT company. And that's all I knew. So how was I going to answer that? Because I didn't know, like, how am I different from her if I don't know what the details were of why she left and her impetus, and that would I completely fumbled. But really what I wanted to say was, is that because I have a vagina? Like, did you ask the guys this question? And of course, afterward, I went out and I asked them all, because we knew each other really well, we'd been on the trail together, and none of them got asked that question. Oh boy, I can't see that far. Oh yeah, the recurring theme of, also occurred to me of, like, prove yourself. How do we know that you're gonna stick around? It's just like medical school, you gotta prove yourself as this person in front of us, this woman. And then the other thing I want to say is, who do you think? You're probably thinking right now, but who asked those questions? And I just want to tell you that it's not who you think. And that's partly why I highlighted these, because these are good people. These good men, I know them well. I can surmise that they asked, I don't really know, but I can surmise because I came across a certain way, or that I look too much like Susan or seem too much like Susan. This is a paper in Lancet in 2019 about gender diversity and inclusion in medicine. They cover a couple myths and solutions. And their first myth is that other people are biased, not me. And research suggests that not only that all of us are biased, but that we have to be in order to survive, and that cognitive biases and heuristics are shortcuts that allow us to interact meaningfully with people. Otherwise, we would be completely overwhelmed all the time and be apoplectic, basically, in all our interactions. And when it comes to devaluing women's contributions in masculinized settings like emergency medicine was back then, that women can be just as biased as men. And they suggest that more than changing individual attitudes, which is partly why I came up here and talked about this instead of my lovely charts and tables, is that systematic changes are needed. And they suggest implicit bias training, not just like testing where we press those buttons and different faces come up and we see how biased we are, but imbuing us with an actual skill set so that we can judge if there's bias in our interactions, and specifically in the impact. Like every behavior has an intent that's only known to the performer and an impact that's really only known to the recipient. And we may have good intent, like those men may have, but if it doesn't transfer over to the impact, if your bias comes in, then that's what we need to think about, and we need to be able to assess that. And then in formal settings, we need vetted, standardized questions to which potential answers have been considered in light of a diverse set of backgrounds. So, at the very least, if you're going to ask, how do we know you're not going to be like Susan, you got to ask it of everybody, not just the brown-eyed people. The other myth is that we have to fix women and that we need to lean in, we're all told this, and to negotiate better and not to apologize during our talks. I think I actually might have done that when I first started. Anyway, we need to be more assertive, and we're trying, but what's neglected in that approach is that the backlash that women often experience because of those behaviors for violating expectations of warmth and so-called feminine niceness. And of course, I have to wonder, in asking those questions that Jerry told me to ask, did I come off as too assertive? And did that result in a little bit of backlash in that I didn't get chosen to be trained here in Canada? And they suggest we need to change institutional norms. And norms are the conventional patterns of behavior that are considered acceptable by a social group. And people of all gender identities are under pressure to conform to the gender norms. And of course, in emergency medicine, I was thinking about what norm. One of them would be the work hard, play hard norm. I'm pretty willing to bet that, like me, there's a substantial number of men who don't really want to go out mountain biking and getting bugs in their face and risking injury and would rather read the New York Times Sunday Review section. But we're all sort of pushed, and I know I did a very informal survey of some trainees who want to go into emergency medicine, and they still feel like they have to do these things in order to fit in. And our patients are not all really competitive, outdoorsy types. Why do we all need to be? So back to my story, I went to the second round and matched OB-GYN, and I thought about staying there because I felt like I fit in there. It was all women except for one male. But I had Michael Schul. He had been my mentor, for years by that point. We'd worked together a lot in the ER, and he just kept pushing me and saying, you need to transfer into U of T, you need to do this, you need to do that. And to cut a long story short, I did after a lot of work. And now we're going to have a brief, fun interlude to identify people. Hopefully you can identify them. Here's Eddie Lang. The one in the corner is Epcot Center, Riyad Abuladin and Mike. I think there's Atlanta. Lori's here. I think we'd finished dinner, and there was a horse behind us, and we had a bit to drink, and so we were all being horses. CAEP down below with Yasmin Khan and Lisa Thurger. This is the Montreal group at ACEP. What a great group. I didn't know any of them other than I saw when I showed up, and they just embraced me, and we had a great time. And I'd met Vincent in New York, and you'll recognize probably Sunil Upati as well. I love this picture of Sarah. It just says it all, brandishing, with a smile on her face, brandishing a lightsaber. This is our residency group, and you can see also some guys from the West Coast. I think that was a CAEP. So into the 2000s, residency was finally going well. I applied to the Annals of Emergency Medicine resident editorialship, thinking I'd never get it because it was really competitive, and I did get it. And it was an amazing year. I was exposed to EM researchers from across America, as well as the UK and Australia, and I learned about the passive voice in writing versus the active voice and how graphs can be misleading and all that good stuff. But it also led to more integration with the American body of emergency medicine, who had welcomed me initially and at UCLA. And I know, I went on eventually after a number of years peer reviewing, I became a decision editor there, that I'm often seen as the American by my Canadian EM scientists. And I think that's starting to change, and now I got this award. I'm really hoping it's changed because I've never been American. Like, my mother would be horrified as a British person, I'm being identified this way. Anyway, in my fourth year, I did a master's in Clinepe, much to my surprise. I did the classes and didn't quite make it to the end of June because I gave birth to these guys at full term. And so I took 7 months mat leave and then in the 5 months left over, I worked on my thesis, and I defended my thesis in September of my 5th year when I was trying to study to pass. And my thesis was triage of AMI patients. But of course, it could have been a good nanny is such a gift. Just so you know, that's how I got through. And then I became new staff at Sunnybrook, as well as ICS, the Sunnybrook Research Institute. I got a CIHR fellowship to continue studying AMIs in the ED, and I had great mentorship from Michael Schul. And then Glenn Bandiera was talking to Paul Dorian, who's a cardiologist, one day, and he said, do you have anyone in emergency medicine who's a scientist and might like AFib? And that, when Glenn sponsored me and put my name forward, was the beginning of all that I have ended up with here and ending up on this stage. And at one point, he even put me forward for a CCS New Investigator Award, and I won it, like the 2012. There was one, and they gave it to someone who's not a cardiologist, which blows my mind, and was amazing. Jack, too, with his teen grants, he's since died of a heart attack, unfortunately, and Judd Hollander, who helped me to cut through all the papers and just make a decision faster. You'll notice none of them are men. And that was fine by me. It never really occurred to me that there would need to be otherwise. But one of my male colleagues said to me, how come you women don't like network more? Why don't you, we say to each other, hey man, I saw you did that paper, and I could have made an intellectual contribution, why didn't you put me on your paper? And I'm really grateful for him for saying that, because then I reached out to about 5 other women who I barely knew in my institute, 2 endocrinologists, 1 respirologist, an internist, and a family physician, all clinician scientists. And that was 10 years ago. And we go out for lunch and have wine. That's how I started it, every couple months. And we've seen each other through divorce, job loss, kids getting sick, so many things. And it's been absolutely wonderful, just from learning about where the good parking is and to use endo instead of RefMan. We pass down formal kids' clothes because they wear them once, right? And they're expensive, those suits, when they graduate to high school. And of course, we put each other on each other's papers. And that has been such a support for me. I would highly recommend it. So things are going well overall. I hate getting the review. I can't look at them for a day or two. And I was producing lots of papers, and I got grants, and I was going to conferences. But about 4 years in, I hit another barrier. And I had trouble getting analyst time. And I'm a health services researcher. So what I do is I crunch data from 14 million Ontarians. And that's quite hard to do, and you need an analyst to do it. And if you don't have an analyst, then you don't have any papers. And this went on. Every 2 months, I would send an email saying, hey, am I in the queue? Because the other scientists in my pod were more senior than me, and they were using the limited number of analysts that they had. And that went on. Every 2 months, I send a nice email, and I didn't have an analyst for a year. And you might say, well, why didn't I complain? Molly Shannon's one of our residents, and she just presented at Academic Day a couple weeks ago a qualitative piece where she interviewed successful women in emergency medicine. And one of the themes that came out is we don't want to be labeled as difficult. And that's exactly why I didn't speak up, because then I'm going to be the difficult one who keeps asking for more stuff, and you never want that dreaded label. So I tried to get around this by learning to program SAS myself, which I did. It took a lot of hours to do it. I learned it from Google, basically, the source of all knowledge. And I came up with 2 papers, and the first one, basically put my name on the map. It was about AMI patients and how quickly they present to the ER with their chest pain if they're married compared to if they're not married. And obviously, they came in much earlier if they were married. The whole idea was how about let's not complain about women nagging and say, hey, thank you for saving my life. And with the women, it made no difference if they were married or not. And this got picked up by the New York Times, CNN, Time, and even Jay Leno used it in his opening monologue, which was great, and it put me on the map, I guess. But what do you do with that finding? All men, you should get married. What's the takeaway? So there was that. And I gave myself a PE, bilateral, segmental, and subsegmental PEs. And I don't love putting my medical history out there. I didn't tell anyone for a couple of years. I didn't want to be seen as somehow weaker. Maybe I'm just going to go back to my AFib talk. I've got one here backed up. Yeah, no, I'm just kidding. Yes, I sat for too long, I guess. And this is actually, I'd finished, I had it for 6 weeks and didn't know. I thought I was one of those people with low pain threshold and a bit whiny. And I was probably in way more pain than all of my patients. I couldn't sneeze. The pain was so excruciating when I started to sneeze. I think my vagus nerve just shut it down, and the sneeze would stop, and I would almost faint because I was in so much pain. It was shoulder pain is what it started at in my biceps. Anyway, The point is, medicine research is hard. And yes, I'd gotten around it, but now I'd had another issue. And in emergency medicine, we don't often talk about the attrition rate for clinician scientists, both overall or for women. And probably part of that is there's so few of us, the 95% confidence intervals would be massive. And I tried to just find the data for clinician scientists overall, and I couldn't find it. But I could find for pure scientists, and keep in mind that it's easier for pure scientists because they're not trying to juggle their clinical responsibilities. They can just focus on their research. And this is kind of hard to interpret, but basically, in the 1960s, the half-life of one of these scientist cohorts was 35 years, and then half of them would have left after 35 years. In 2010, the half-life was 5 years, and then half of them had left. So not easy. There was a study in Annals of Maternal Medicine at over 1,000 K08 or K23 NIH award recipients. This is a career support award. And they found that women spent 8.5 more hours per week than the men on domestic activities. And that works out to 13,260 extra hours for them to work than us, than me, or 1,657 extra work days. Can you imagine the amount I could have gotten done? And then, of course, the necessity of adult supervision means that one parent has to be, if one parent is on an overnight shift, the responsibility of the kids switches to the other parent. And God forbid, if you're married to another shift worker, or you're a surgeon who has to go in on call, or you're a single parent. I got a nanny who, well, my nanny actually switched to live-in, which was how I dealt with it. But at the same time, you're still the captain of the ship. They don't do anything without you intervening, so you're juggling so much. And it is my observation, I don't have a lot of data to support this, that shift work is not really conducive to being highly productive in research. I'm often approached, not often, but not infrequently, by residents or junior staff who are like, wow, I can't believe, the publications you had in Annals of Maternal Medicine. I'd give anything for those publications. But from my vantage point, where I work with clinician scientists of all different fields, mostly cardiologists and oncologists, but others as well, I'm not really doing that great. I really should have more and have done more. And I think emergency medicine, we have such great people that we should be producing on par with these internists and cardiologists and oncologists. In emergency medicine, we have a bit of a communist approach. So the day that you graduate, you get paid the same as you do 20 years later. And your shift responsibility is the same that day as it is 20 years later, usually until you're about 60 or 65, depending on your group. And you can try and trade them all, and that's what I do. I spend a hell of a lot of time trying to trade into more reasonable hours where I can think properly. And that's okay, but I think this is a consequence of that approach. I think that's why we aren't as well established as my cardiology colleagues or my cancer colleagues. I work with them as well, or endocrinologists, because we're fighting jet lag a couple times a month. And if you compare us to surgeons, I would say we're probably a little better than them, and that's because they work overnight too. And we're people, and we need certain physiology. And I said this truism to my daughter on Thursday night when I walked by her room and her light was still on and I was going to bed. And I said, thinking is easier if you've slept properly, by which I mean if you have slept the appropriate number of hours during the time period when your body releases melatonin naturally, you will be able to think better. So that when someone asks you, okay, you have this cohort of ITPW weighted on the propensity score, and I want to add some new data with their meds and link it, you can actually think this through, which is what I did on Friday when someone approached me about a cohort I have. And I could figure out that I was going to have to rerun the whole propensity score ITPW matching unless we're using it as an outcome. But on a regular day, when I'm jet lagged, like think how much longer that takes me, and you make mistakes. So what do we need to increase our EM research output both in quality and quantity? In my view, we need schedules that rival our successful internal medicine colleagues, and in particular, ones that support our working mothers or mother role. I don't care if you're he, she, or they. You're the person who schedules the play dates and goes on field trips and schedules the pediatrician, dentist, and specialist visits and then takes them to and gets cash from the bank machine and then turns it into loonies and toonies because your kids ask for money for the bake sale and that's what they need, and you pay the nanny and you take the gym shoes to the school when it's wintertime and they've worn their boots. That person needs support. To get back those 1,657 and a half extra work hours that we could have, not that I'm counting. And there's little things we can do too. I recently started asking all of my groups, there's some U of T committees, as well as my research groups, how about we start at 9:15? Because when we start at 9, I'm either dropping off my kids early at school and they got to stand around and wait, and I feel like a shitty mom, or I drop them off on time and I arrive sort of like disheveled and 2 minutes late and looking less than professional. So how about we just start at 9:15? And every single group so far has taken me up on that, which is great. We need to continue with great mentorship. So sponsorship, whenever we find someone who's the least bit interested, let's sponsor that person, including those who don't look like us or that work hard, play hard. And we need to actively avoid the nail that sticks out gets hammered down so that we don't have to fear looking difficult. So reaching out and asking in advance, do you have enough analyst time? Do you have admin support? Do you have financial? What can I help you with if you're in the position where you can ask that? And more next generation women clinician scientist groups like I had with my group. And that's what I'm actively working on now for my junior clinician scientists. We also need to speak up on their behalf because we're now in a place of job security. This is the responsibilities that I mentioned earlier that I see we have. Because telling a resident, or God forbid a medical student, that you need to stand up for yourself if you think you've been, marginalized in some way, like, come on. Like, residency is basically a 5-year job interview, and there's going to be outcomes associated with that if you do it. But how about if you could talk to someone like me, and no one's going to, get me out of my job, I hope, anyway. So I would rather that I did that than them having to do that, because I don't think they really realistically can. Last part of the talk, that timer's not going off, so I have no idea how far I am. Oh, damn it. Okay, so infiltrating another group. So I'm part of the CCS primary APHID panel since 2014, and it's kind of amazing how if you do a lot of research in an area, suddenly you become like the world expert, and you're like, oh no, I guess I know the answer to that because I did the research and no one else just happens to have done it, but somehow that made me a world expert. You got to do a lot of studies on AFib in this case, but then they ask you to be part of it, and then you can help direct practice, which is really powerful and a reward in and of itself. And don't worry, I'm not going to become a cardiologist. I'm still part of the CAEP group as well. I think we need to do it more because otherwise groups that have no actual experience in ED environment can somewhat indirectly be directing our practice, and sometimes there's just a vacuum. And for example, when our group was talking about giving a DOAC before, this is the CCS, before you cardioverted a patient, initially I went with it, and then I said, well, wait a minute, rivaroxaban doesn't get absorbed if you don't eat it with a meal. And they were like, so? I said, but you don't want someone eating a meal before you knock them out, because they don't do that. That's not part of their practice. It's sort of dead silence that I was met with, and now that's going to come in the next revisions. It's also symbiotic. I'm doing a talk on Tuesday about how to prescribe DOACs, and I came across something which wasn't clear in any of the papers if there was an interaction between DILT and DOACs. And I emailed them and got 15 answers within an hour of what they actually do in practice, which was amazing. And I will tell you on Tuesday if you come to my talk. It also gives you a rich perspective that you can bring back to emergency medicine, because you go to the conferences and you hear all this cutting edge stuff, and then you can bring it back to your group, which is pretty amazing. I would say it's not always easy. I get talked over a lot. I am not a very stentorian voice. I wish I was, but I'm not. And sometimes they vote, and it's emergency medicine practice, and I vote against it, and they vote for it, and then it gets passed. And it's in the guideline, and my name's on it. It looks like I endorsed it, but I didn't. So that you kind of just got to accept. Almost done. Okay, final takeaways. When I was talking to Mike Schul about this talk on Wednesday, he said, to me, the prevailing theme of your whole career was one of resilience. And he said something that's not that easy to teach. Maybe it's life experience. And I was like, well, you know what? That's what I'm going to talk about. If you're going into this field, or any field really, and you really want something, get back up again. Look, I got here. I finally got here. It's worth it. And if I made it up onto this stage, so can anyone. Like from where I came from and my natural abilities, I just worked really hard, and somehow I got this award by getting back up again. Now that said, I think we should not have to be quite as resilient as I was, the PE, all that stuff. And we should try and make it a little bit easier if we can. So remember that women and potentially minorities are told that they need to work twice as hard to get here. So let's embrace that and capitalize on those achievements like the Americans do. Let's establish formal policies that counteract our implicit biases around gender norms. And remember the attrition curve, or at the very least, my PE. Be proactive in counteracting that attrition curve whenever you can with schedules that support your scientists, and be responsive to requests and avoid the dreaded label of you're difficult. The next R is, other than resilience, is relationships. So obviously I would not be here without my mentor, Mike Schul. I would have gone off in a different direction. Mentees give you inspiration every day, and your colleagues just show you different ways of doing things. And it's so great to be surrounded by super smart people that help you learn. And obviously cross-collaboration with another specialty can pay great dividends for both specialties, as I've outlined. The last one is really a pay it forward, but my daughter said if you do the other two as R's, you got to make the third one an R. So we came up with repay as a pay it forward. And I think you all probably know who Anna-Maria Tremonti is, and I think she's a great example of that. She's a wonderful, I listened to her on the CBC radio, well-respected Canadian journalist. And when she was very young, she experienced domestic violence, and she didn't talk about it then because she knew that it would label her as the domestic violence Canadian journalist. And she didn't want that, so she went on for another 30 years, established herself as the strong reputation, but never forgot to go back and pay it forward. When she was in a place of job security where it wouldn't taint her or color her in any way. And now, she tells the story and you just think, well, if it happened to Anna-Maria Tremonti, it could happen to anyone. It doesn't in any way color her. So I think that's a really great example of paying it forward. And also Brian Rowe, I could have put him in to infiltrate other specialties too. But that guy, by being at CIHR, I wonder if this award would even exist if it weren't for Brian being there. And thank you if it was you. This is so great from all his work. And there are others as well, but another great example of paying it forward, and which I would like to do now. This is my daughter. Maternal guilt is a term we hear very early on as mothers, or the mother role. And of course, I was working so hard, I gave myself a PE, and I wondered what I was doing to my kids. And one day, I took back a keyboard to Staples because it didn't work or something, and she sat in the back of my car in her booster seat, and I could hear her typing away really fast on the keyboard, and I thought, oh, she's playing secretary. And I pulled up to Staples and turned off the car, and I turned around and looked at her, and I said, what you doing? And she said, oh, I'm writing a grant. And I was like, oh God, I didn't ruin my child. I gave her a good example. It changed my life. I don't know that we can have it all, but I would say from my vantage point, it's pretty great what I've got. And great friends help too. Woo! Done. Questions? Thank you. No time for questions.
So if we have no questions, I'll go ahead, and it's a great pleasure to award this very important 2022 Mid-Career Lecture Award in Emergency Medicine, CAEP-CIHR, to Dr. Clare Atzema. Thank you.
Okay, and on to the next talk.